guys, it's Kira and welcome to the first reading wrap up of 2022. And to be perfectly honest, the first reading wrap up I have filmed in a very long time. I think some point towards the beginning of last year I kind of abandoned monthly reading wrap ups, and that was because I wasn't at work due to lockdown, and that meant that I was filming daily vlogs, or at least I was filming weekly vlogs where I could actually update you every single day, and that meant that I felt reading wrap ups were very repetitive because I'd already given you all of my thoughts and real-time reviews and ratings in all of my vlogs, whereas now I'm of course back at work, we're no longer in lockdowns, and I feel like I finally have more things to say to you because I'm not vlogging every single day. And aside from that, I've just kind of missed filming these wrap-ups because they are a fun way to round up the month of reading and then move on to the next one. So without further ado, January has been and gone, and I managed to read a total of 6 books in January, and also an additional one that I read half of and then DNF'd, so we'll dive into all of that in just a second. But now, grab yourself a cup of tea, I'd recommend it of course, and then let's dive into the wrap up. January started on a high for me with a thriller, and that thriller was Reckless Girls by Rachel Hawkins. Now, I'd actually never heard of this book, but I received it from Book of the Month at the beginning of January, and I was very excited when I dove in and read the description because it sounded right up my street, mostly because I had just filmed my 2021 top 10 books of the year, and as you may know if you've seen that video, one of my favourite books of last year was And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, and this book is in part inspired by that novel, so that connection was very exciting. I will preface that by saying it's not a faithful adaptation, or rather like retelling of that novel. It's not like a direct sort of modern version of that book, but it definitely has a similar essence, and you can see definite similarities between the two books and their themes and settings, and it's definitely true to say that if you enjoy one, you'll likely enjoy the other. So I was very excited to have a similar book to that, especially because filming that reading wrap up with my top 10 books of last year made me like excited about Agatha Christie all over again, so this was just like perfect timing. And then aside from that, this is a book which is a thriller and a murder mystery set on a desert island, and one thing I have learnt about my reading over the last couple of years is that I am a sucker for a desert island thriller. I think there's just something about that tight-knit community setting where something starts to go wrong and then everything unravels and you just don't know who you can trust, you don't know if your favourite characters are going to be safe, and everything just feels so edgy and you just feel so like intensely gripped by the novel. I love that. I think they're incredible. I know they may be cliche, but I love it, and I was so excited to dive into another book of that sort in Reckless Girls. So to give you a bit of a preface on what this book is about, we have a main character, Lux, who has recently moved temporarily to Hawaii with her boyfriend. Her boyfriend is from quite a rich family and he has a boat, and their plan is ultimately to save money and do up the boat in Hawaii and then go off and travel the world together, sail the seas and all that jazz. But while they are working in Hawaii and trying to do up that boat, they're approached by 2 richer girls who want them to basically sail them out to this like renowned desert island where some terrible things are said to have happened, and essentially they're just like thrill-seeking tourists. So of course they take them out to this desert island. Our main character and her boyfriend and these 2 other girls get there. They find that there are some other similar thrill-seeking tourists out there, and they create this kind of like party together, creating this incredible time, having a wonderful time on this desert island, despite knowing that some terrible things have previously happened there, and lo and behold, terrible things start to happen again. I won't say too much more because of course it is a thriller and I don't want to give any spoilers, but it is definitely similar to And Then There Were None. We have terrible things start to happen, paradise unravels. Any fans of the film The Beach by Leonardo DiCaprio, I think you'd appreciate this book as well because it has that similar utopian style of a beginning and then gradually everything descends into chaos. And for me, I was gripped right from the start to the end. It was a really interesting, fast-paced book. Not too long, but also you feel like you get plenty of detail, and I absolutely loved it. I gave it 4 stars and would definitely recommend it, especially to people who have enjoyed, like I said, Agatha Christie in general, but especially And Then There Were None, but also Lucy Foley's 2 books, The Hunting Party and The Guest List, I feel have a very similar vibe as well, and I personally really enjoyed it. Moving on to a slightly more sophisticated novel next, I read Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen for my All About Austen read-along, which I'm doing. Actually, I'm on the final book now. We're reading Persuasion this month, so the All About Austen read-along is nearly over, which I'm very sad about. But Northanger Abbey was the pick that I read in January, and I was really excited to dive back into this one because it was a reread for me. This was actually the very first Jane Austen novel that I read years and years and years ago when I was probably about 16, and I enjoyed it at the time, but I definitely think wasn't like quite as into Jane Austen and therefore didn't like really appreciate her humour and her wit. But now, having come back to it as like a fully fledged Jane Austen fangirl, I was really excited to see how much more I would appreciate it. I would say this is probably Jane Austen's most conscious comedy novel, in the sense that it is like such a satire. Essentially in this book we have a main character, Catherine, who Jane Austen kind of makes fun of because she kind of like sees herself as like one of life's heroines, but Jane Austen doesn't see her that way, and she uses this character who is just like a young girl who is out in society for the first time and is very into books and therefore has this very like fantastical view of what life should be like. Jane Austen uses those tropes to then make fun of the gothic novels that were very popular at the time, and essentially I think Jane Austen just wanted to use this book to kind of make other authors and also readers take themselves less seriously. So it is all very comedic, very kind of like caricatured, in the sense that we just get these really extreme characters who are very like dramatic or very, very horrible, and we just have like these very polarizing characters, and I for one absolutely loved it. I think the first time that I read this book I went into it expecting it to be a gothic novel, because I think sometimes the way that it is sold to people is a bit misleading, whereas this time around I went in definitely aware that it was a satire of the gothic novel, and that transformed my like experience of the book, because it just meant that I could really appreciate the humour and appreciate the fact that she was just essentially trying to just make fun of people who take literature too seriously, which I for one absolutely love, because I think books are sometimes just there to be entertaining, and that is completely okay, and an entertaining book isn't any less good than a philosophical one in terms of its like moral impact on the world. You know, someone who reads philosophers isn't any better than someone who reads romance, and I think that's what Jane Austen in her way was trying to achieve here. So I loved that message, and I also think that Catherine for me is actually one of Jane Austen's most relatable protagonists, because of the fact that she is a reader herself and she allows her world to be kind of romanticized by the novels that she reads, and I feel like that was so relatable, because I'm sure I can agree with, and maybe you guys as readers as well will be able to relate to, the fact that sometimes you can get sucked into the world of books and allow a fictional version of the world to kind of like, I guess, rose tint the actual world that we live in, and also to like cloud your expectations of what reality might actually be like. And I think, especially looking back at who I was at the age when Catherine was in this book, so about like 18, 19, I could definitely see that I was probably far more like romanticising of the world and all of that kind of stuff. And I think it's just very, very relatable as a reader to see a main character who isn't necessarily perfect but allows herself to romanticise life because it's fun, and I love that. I think this book just has such a great vibe. It's a very funny, relatable characters, and I just think such a like kindred spirit for any readers out there. So love this one, would recommend it, and I often get questions in my Jane Austen reading vlogs and also other classics reading vlogs as well on what Jane Austen book to start with, and I think this is an incredible one to start with because it's a very, very short, it's like only 200 and something pages, and it's also, like I said, very funny, easy to follow, and I think just a general great time. Now, despite having started the month with two incredible reads that I really, really enjoyed, we couldn't stay on a high all month apparently, so the next book I picked up was my dreaded DNF, and that was The People in the Trees by Hanya Yanagihara. Now, I was a big fan of A Little Life, which is of course Hanya Yanagihara's most famous novel, and of course she recently brought out her new book To Paradise, which I'm also looking to read at some point soon. So I was excited to read The People in the Trees because I was just kind of feeling hyped to get back into her writing, but this book ended up being a huge disappointment. I'm going to put my tea down because I want to let you know exactly how far I got into this book. So this book has a total of 350 8 pages, I think my copy has, and I managed to make it to 156 pages. So when I say I DNF'd, I did give it what I think was a good chance to wow me, but it just ended up getting worse and worse with each page that went past, which is, for me at least, not the experience I'm looking for from my books. So essentially, I'm going to read you the blurb of this book because I think it's important to know how the book is sold and then the reality that we actually have. So, the blurb says, in 1950, Norton Perina, a young doctor, embarked on an expedition to a remote Micronesian island in search of a rumoured lost tribe. There he encounters a strange group of jungle dwellers who appear to have attained a form of immortality. Perina uncovers their secret and returns to America, where he soon finds great success. But his discovery comes at a terrible cost, not only for the island, but for Perina himself. Both riveting and unsettling, The People in the Trees explores the various faces of the misuse of power when cultures collide. So I assumed that we were going to follow this doctor on his trip to the island, see his experience of finding these people who have discovered immortality, and then I guess the result of what happens when he tries to kind of steal that revelation as his own and bring it back to the Western world. And I thought that was going to make a very, very interesting novel. But actually the way that the book starts is that you find out that this doctor has several years into the future actually been convicted of child abuse and has been taken to prison. He is no longer famous. Everyone has renounced him because of course he has done something really, really terrible, except for this one guy who is absolutely obsessed with him, and this guy has taken it upon himself to write the guy's memoirs so that he can kind of clear the doctor's name essentially. So that in and of itself was a very odd way to start the novel, because I think you immediately have no empathy for the main character because you see him as someone who's done something really, really terrible. Whereas I feel like, generally speaking, it would be better to get to know a character first and then see them on their journey versus finding out they're a bad person right at the beginning. For me at least means that I'm not really very invested in them as a character, especially finding out that he'd done something as terrible as he had right at the start of the novel just meant that I was kind of disturbed by him right from the very beginning of the novel and had no interest in following his story because I knew kind of where it went. Now that might be a literary device, and potentially later on in the novel it might be revealed that he didn't do the crimes that he's been accused of. I'm not really sure, but for me, finding that out right at the beginning of the book just made me really uncomfortable with the book, and I just wasn't interested in him as a main character because I think you need to be able to root for your main character, and I couldn't root for someone who had been convicted of those crimes. So that was kind of the first thing that put me off of the book. However, it did start fairly strong. Aside from that a bit of an odd introduction to the way that the novel was going to be told, we got a bit of an interesting insight into the guy's childhood and everything, but then it dove into his academic life. He was at university and then eventually going to the island, and this book was so saturated with scientific jargon that it just became absolutely painful to read. And along with that, it's also written in a format where there are loads and loads of footnotes left by the guy who is supposedly writing the doctor's memoirs. So it's a very disjointed style of writing that constantly takes you out of the flow of the novel, and it got to a point at that page 156 where I literally just could not bring myself to go any further. I didn't care about the main character, I hated the writing style, there was so much unnecessary scientific language in there, and it just wasn't compelling me at all. So I decided to put it down and not torture myself any further, and I definitely want to try and do that more often. I generally like to finish books and see them through because I think books can change and pull you in at the end, but I think sometimes when you get to that point about halfway through and you still don't love a novel, it's sometimes better to just cut your losses, because at the end of the day I'm reading for fun and I'm reading for enjoyment because I want to find books that I love. So forcing myself through books that I hate doesn't really seem very conducive to progress there, and I just decided to move on to something better. And the next book I read was absolutely incredible, so I'm really glad that I decided to move on and find a better book. The next book that I picked up was The Castaways by Lucy Clark. So we're keeping it on theme with the desert island murder mysteries and thrillers, because this book definitely fits into that category. So in this novel, we actually have a plane crash, which I thought was going to be a very, very interesting sort of like concept for a novel, and I was absolutely right. But what I didn't see coming was that it was actually going to be told from two perspectives, one from someone who was on the plane and one from someone who was left behind. So we have two sisters, we have Laurie and Erin, and Laurie was on the plane and she is telling her story from leading up to the crash of the plane itself, and then we have Erin, the sister that was meant to join Laurie on their holiday but ended up staying behind, and we see her like life story and her chapters from the perspective of after the crash. So we're getting a very rounded view, but also like only one-sided at each end, which I think was really interesting and super compelling. Personally, as I'm sure many of you know if you've ever seen my wrap-ups of vlogs or any discussion about books before, I find that dual perspective narratives are just incredible, and they are almost always guaranteed to make me like a book more, because I just find them so incredibly compelling, and I think the way that they round out a narrative and give you more context is just always such a great thing, and like literally never makes a book worse and almost always makes it 10 times better, because I just think obviously it's really nice to get to know one character, as we often do with the protagonist, but the chance to see things from two different sides I just think is really, really transformative when getting to know a story, and especially one which contains a mystery. It is just game changing. So I loved that in and of itself within this novel. And then I also loved the fact that it wasn't just dual perspective, but as I mentioned, it was also dual timeline. And again, that just adds such a level of intrigue and mystery to the point where you just don't know what you're going to find out from each of the characters, and you also don't know what pieces of information from each of the two narratives and two timelines will sort of influence the next. And there's just a lot of back and forth information going between the two narratives, which just eventually makes this incredibly rich tapestry of a mystery which I just could not put down. I absolutely loved it. I think the fact that it was focusing on two sisters was a really interesting concept as well, and I just loved the way that this mystery of how the plane crash happened and who survived, if anyone, was just really, really interesting to watch unfold. And I loved it. I really, really did. I thought it was so well told. I absolutely could not put it down, and it was just incredible and exactly what I needed after the terrible slump that I felt like I was in after putting down The People in the Trees. So again, any fans of Reckless Girls and Then There Were None, Lucy Foley, pick this book up, because it is so thrilling, super intense, and I for one did not see the mystery that was coming, like the twist that was coming at the end. It was just really, really gripping, and I loved it. So I did listen to one audiobook this month, and oh my god, it was incredible, and I think probably the best book that I read in January because it was so interesting. It was Love As Always Mum by Mae West, who, for anyone that doesn't know, is one of the daughters of Fred and Rose West, who were a married couple and also a serial killer duo in the UK in I think the 60s and 70s. Now, I personally am quite interested in true crime. I find it really intriguing, and so I've listened to lots of true crime podcasts, watched YouTube videos, watched documentaries on the topic, and just in general I'm quite interested in it. And because of that, I was very much aware of who Fred and Rose were, what their crimes were, and just kind of like how their life stories went down. And I of course knew that they had lots and lots of children together. Like they had like an insane amount of children, I think like 8, 9, 10, something along those lines. There were lots of them. So I knew that they had children, but of course the story of their murders is usually told from the perspective of who they were, their life story, what they did, and then how it went down after they were caught. So I'd never heard things from a different perspective, but I thought it was so interesting to hear something from the perspective of their daughter. So May is their second oldest daughter. Fred did have other children before he was married to Rose, but as a couple together, May was their second child and the second oldest daughter. And then the oldest daughter, Heather, was actually murdered by Fred, which is just horrific and just so terrible. And the book goes into that in a lot of detail. But essentially, we just hear May's life story as she remembers it, which of course dives into what her parents ended up doing and the things that she had heard her parents say about their lives before children and all of that kind of information. But you hear it really like from the horse's mouth, like as someone who lived in that house where all of those terrible things went down as she experienced it. And what I thought was so I guess like poignant and just like really, really sad was the fact that they, as children in this house, suffered so much abuse that abuse was kind of tantamount to normal to them. It was all that they knew. But even knowing how bad their parents could be towards them, they had absolutely no idea what they were capable of outside of the realms of their family, and so they had no idea what sort of crimes their parents had committed until it came to light and they were convicted. And I just think as children who were already suffering so much, to then find out that your parents had done something so terrible must have just been absolutely life-shattering. And then we see the sort of like gradual process thing that May goes through after the point of her parents being sort of like arrested, and how at first she never wanted to believe that her mum had any part to play in these crimes because that would just shatter her world even more, and she needed something to kind of anchor her. But eventually her realisation and acceptance of the fact that both of her parents were guilty, and I just thought the way that she explored her entire life story was just really captivating, and like I said, a very sad, very sobering topic, and just like really difficult to listen to at times, but certainly very interesting, especially for anyone who, like me, already has an interest in true crime. Next up, for the Dark Academics Book Club, I read Thus Were Their Faces by Silvina Ocampo, which is a collection of short stories of the like gothic genre, and I ended up giving this 2 stars. I have very little to say because, to be perfectly honest, my reading of this book was in some places very much like a skim reading, because I just really hate short story collections. I find them so hard to get into. I generally find that there are 1 or 2 that really stand out, and then the rest just feel disappointing by comparison. And I just find them very difficult to get into. So this isn't to say that it's not a good collection of short stories, but that's not really my preferred style of book, and therefore it's never going to be something that I love. But they were very odd, very gothic. There were a lot of like weird twists in the novels, and some of them were quite captivating, but on the whole it just wasn't for me. So that's that. Now, January was a month of lots and lots of like thrillers, crimes, mysteries, and I was really enjoying that genre. So I decided to keep it within that genre roughly, but go for something a little bit different for my final read of the month, and that was Small Great Things by Jodi Picoult. Now, I really like Jodi Picoult. I got into a bit of a phase of reading lots of her books back in 2019, and then I kind of like went cold on it for a little while and hadn't read anything from her in ages, but this book had been on my shelves for quite a while, and I just fancied reading it this month. So this book is, as I mentioned, somewhat related to the crime thriller mystery genre, because all of Jodi Picoult's books focus on some kind of crime, but rather than being sort of like about a crime and then a mystery surrounding who's committed it, or being about like a detective trying to figure things out, Jodi's books always are focused on a crime that seems fairly obvious, like we know who the supposed perpetrator is, and it seems like you obviously have a pretty clear idea of what's gone on and potentially who might be to blame. So it's never about figuring out who has done something, but instead it focuses on the legal battle that follows the crime. And by giving you multiple perspectives and often multiple timelines as well, Jodi Picoult really takes something that might seem fairly obvious and creates a huge amount of nuance and complexity around this topic to really provide an in-depth look into what has gone on and who might be to blame for the situation. So in this book in particular, the beginning of the book takes place on a labour and delivery ward, and we have our main character, who is called Ruth. She is a nurse on this ward, and she also happens to be the only African American nurse on this ward. And then we have a family, the Bowers, who have just recently had their baby. They're still in hospital, and Ruth goes in to do some routine checks. But this family, as it turns out, are actually white supremacists, and immediately insist that Ruth is not to touch their child, come anywhere near them, because they don't want a black nurse dealing with them or their family. So immediately that is like a big shock in the novel, and actually the blurb doesn't tell you that race is actually going to be a key topic of this book at all. So suddenly when you see like how intensely racist this family is, it really takes you by surprise, because I personally didn't see it coming. I had no idea that was what the book was going to be about. So that is really intense, but then things go downhill very quickly, because the baby is left with Ruth even though she's told that she's not meant to look after it. Someone else leaves her alone with this baby and tells her to observe it, and while this is happening, the baby baby goes into cardiac arrest, and while Ruth is trying to administer CPR, the baby passes away, and of course a legal battle follows because the parents want to blame Ruth for killing their child, even though she was just doing her job, and then the hospital are more than happy to allow them to do this because that means that they, as a hospital like conglomerate, don't have to take any responsibility for what has happened, and instead they can just use Ruth as a scapegoat. So this book then focuses on three perspectives. We have Ruth, we have the father of this baby, and we have the woman who is like representing Ruth in the legal battle. So we have a lawyer, and then we have both sides, the prosecution and the defence. And it was such an intense read. Now, unlike some of Jodi Picoult's other books, I didn't find this to be as compelling in terms of the multiple perspectives. Now, the reason for that is in all of Jodi Picoult's other books, she takes something that seems fairly obvious and then shows you multiple perspectives, whether that be the person who's supposed to have done something wrong or someone who's accusing them, and I feel like she creates empathy for all of her characters. But in this novel, we of course have the lawyer and we have Ruth, and you can feel empathy for both of them and understand their perspectives. But the dad of the child, who is so racist, his chapters are basically just all filled with horrific hate, and it just is like so intense that I found that there was no way you were going to empathise with him as a character, and instead his chapters just felt very repetitive and also, just like I said, difficult to read because of the content and the language that was used. And so I found that this book was a little bit less strong than some of her others because of the fact that she was unable to create that nuance, because she chose a character that was just going to be 100% unlikable, and therefore there was no balance created in the narrative because you couldn't feel empathy for someone that was so hate-filled and that was such a racist, essentially. So like there was no balance there, and you just immediately only empathise with Ruth, which is obviously correct, like you would only empathise with her, but I usually would go into Jodi Picoult's novels and expect a bit more of a tug of war. Like I said, I didn't go into this one knowing that race was the key theme, and if I did, I wouldn't have expected that from the book, but I just went in expecting one of her typical legal battle novels, and so it was a little bit different to that because you definitely felt strongly empathetic to one character and a lot of disdain for another one. But it was still an interesting novel, and it dove into how racism is so ingrained in society and how much it impacts people of colour and how it can just affect the way that they're treated in everyday society in general, but then how much worse it gets when they're in positions where they've been accused of something wrong. So I thought it was an interesting novel. Like I said, perspectives less strong than I've seen in some of her other ones, and also there was a bit of a twist at the end of this book which I found personally a little bit too out of the left field. Like I was like, that's just not believable in the slightest. I of course won't dive into it because I don't want to give spoilers, but I will say it just felt very, very, very far-fetched, and I kind of felt like almost made a bit of a joke of the rest of the novel because of how like just unbelievable it was. So on the whole, it was an interesting read, and I managed to get through it quite quickly, and I was definitely compelled by the narrative and I found it interesting. But would I recommend it opposed to some of her other books? Probably not, because I definitely think some of her other ones are a lot stronger. But it was still a good book to finish the month on, and on the whole I really did enjoy my month of reading in January. 6 books finished for the month. I was feeling pretty good with the end of that. I'm definitely excited to move on to a new month of reading, hopefully with some more incredible reads. So I would love to know if you read any incredible books in January, and if so, what they were, if you had a particular favourite. Like I said, my favourite book was the audiobook Love As Always Mum by Mae West, and I would recommend that so highly because it was really, really interesting. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the first reading wrap up of 2022, and I'll see you next time.